The ID Evidence API enables you to retrieve data from ID verification events on envelopes sent from your account. For instance, if a recipient verified their identity using a government-issued ID, data might include the first and last name on the ID as well as its expiration date. You can also call the ID Evidence API to download images of the ID that the recipient provided during the ID verification process. By default, DocuSign does not retain any personally identifiable information from an ID verification event. However, you can choose to store additional data from ID verification events on your account by making selections in the admin settings for your account. ID Evidence API requests support integrating identity verification data into business systems such as customer relationship management systems and compliance platforms. For instance, a bank could identify the necessary ID data to log to support compliance with Know Your Customer regulations for account onboarding and loan applications. After enabling retention of this data in their DocuSign account, they would call the ID Evidence API after each successful ID verification to download the relevant customer data provided during that ID verification event. They could also retrieve any ID images the customer provided and add them to their compliance system. Before you make calls to ID Evidence API endpoints, you must first make a couple of calls to the eSignature API. First, you call the eSignature API recipient's endpoint, passing the envelope ID for the agreement you want ID evidence for. The response data includes a unique recipient ID for the recipient who verified their identity. Next, you call the Create Recipient Proof File Resource Token endpoint for the envelope, passing the recipient ID. The response includes a resource token, which you can use to authenticate requests to the ID Evidence API for this envelope and recipient. The lifetime of a resource token is limited to just 2 minutes for additional security. You then use the recipient ID and resource token to call the events endpoint of the ID Evidence API. The response includes the data for the ID verification event that was saved based on the settings you configured for your account. If your settings include retaining ID images, the response also contains a unique URL for each image. When your integration calls one of these URLs, the response includes the base64 encoded image. Let's take a look at how you implement these actions with API requests. First, you need to authenticate to DocuSign and get an access token. Next, you call the recipient's endpoint of the eSignature API. The path includes the envelope ID for the envelope completed with ID verification. The response data includes a signers array, with an object for each signer on the agreement. The signer object includes an identity verification key for each signer who completed ID verification. Your integration must then store the value of the recipient ID queued for the corresponding user for later use. Next, your integration makes a POST request to the eSignature API to obtain a resource token for the envelope recipient. The response includes the resource token, which is valid for 2 minutes. To get ID verification data, you next make a request to the events endpoint of the ID Evidence API. Your request must include an authorization header with a value of bearer, followed by a space and the resource token. In addition, the request path must specify the recipient ID, followed by a period and your requested data format for the response. ID event data can be retrieved as JSON or as a PDF. The response includes the ID verification data for the specified recipient. If your account is configured to save ID images, the response data will include a URL for each image. Your integration can make a GET request to each image URL to retrieve the base64 encoded image.